What is a comic? It's something of a term more broadly applied these days, but at its core, a comic is a unique combination of text and images that are meant to be followed in sequential order. Comics at their core have direction and a tale to tell, and that tale can tell all different kinds of stories. It's a little tricky to point out the exact time frame on the history of comics. Stories via illustrations have been around for thousands of years, since early humans lived in caves. Think of the famous cave paintings from the Ice Age. While the term comic didn't exist until the 1900s, the concept of comics could have existed as early as the 17th century, often in the form of politically charged cartoons. Cartoons have been recorded to have appeared in magazines in the mid-1800s, and the first newspaper comic clips began appearing in the 1890s. Full-on comic books, particularly one known as Comic Monthly, first came about around the 1920s, with each subsequent issue focusing on a different existing and successful comic, otherwise known as reprints. The sales of comic books increased drastically during the era of World War II, with many conveying the triumphs of good over evil and depicting varying degrees of patriotism and strength. This was right around the time that famous superheroes Superman and Batman first appeared in publications as well. And it wasn't just the US. Everywhere from Europe to Japan was beginning to create and consume comics of all kinds. Comics have had their evolutions, their ups and downs, and their genre variations for decades since. There are a few overarching categories when trying to classify comics. Cartoon comics and clippings, comic books, graphic novels, and webtoons are probably the biggest categories. Cartoons and clippings are typically very short in length per issue or episode, and are more geared towards silly humor or politically charged images and text that are often found in newspapers and magazines. The art of these tend to be stylistic, simple, or even both, and black and white strips are just as common as simply colored ones. Calvin and Hobbes, Garfield, and Peanuts are some of the most well-known comic strips to date. Comic books are shorter form pieces of content that contain excerpts of larger and serialized or semi-serialized narratives that can sometimes span years or decades, and are very commonly printed in a magazine-style format either in very saturated color or in grayscale or even black and white. It can be difficult to read a comic book without reading sometimes dozens of previous installments first. Marvel and DC comics are the most popular and well-known examples of these. Graphic novels are longer-form pieces of content that contain complete and often very complex narratives with more narrow focus. This can include manga, a type of graphic novel originating from Japan which is read from right to left and can be published in a variety of languages besides the original Japanese, although this is true of comic books and other graphic novels as well. Mouse and The Walking Dead are also perfect examples of the kinds of complex and one-off stories that graphic novels can tell. Webtoons can be similar to both comic books and graphic novels in terms of how they are presented narratively, with the primary difference being that they are almost exclusively published online and frequently with a vertical panel-based layout. They are often meant to be enjoyed and read on mobile devices like smartphones. Popular genres for webtoons include slice of life, romance, and action-adventure fantasy. Some of the most popular examples with large audiences include titles like Sweet Home, Unordinary, Nerd and Jock, and Lore Olympus. While I am personally most familiar with graphic novels and webtoons, I wanted to give everyone a good idea of what some of the general differences are between these categories since the term comic can sometimes be very open-ended in its interpretation. The literary genres that these comics can fall under is just as varied as book categories. Some of the most popular genres covered across comics of all kinds tend to be comedy, politics, superheroes, fantasy, and action. Cartoons and newspaper clippings tend to have very simple art styles and not a lot of text, not to mention simple paneling, but make no mistake that it takes much more effort to produce them than people would think. To consistently create a cartoon, one must know their characters, should be able to meet somewhat tight deadlines, have strong verbal and written communication skills, and should have a solid basis of knowledge of their subject matter depending on what audience they want to appeal to. Comic book artists need sufficient drawing and illustration capabilities if they want their work to stand out, and many recommend lots of drawing experience, personal and/or professional, before trying to go this route due to the demands of the work, the markets, and competition. Comic artists should focus on developing and honing their own skill and style in order to appeal to their audience and stand out from their competition. Not only that, but storytelling is a huge part of creating a comic book. Many stories are spread out over tens, dozens, perhaps even hundreds of short issues that seldom exceed 50 pages, sometimes even less. Keeping track of the varying perspectives and characters and locations and so on is not always easy. Comic books are typically mass-produced and often require many team members in order to be printed, so collaborative and team-working capabilities are also essential for this career. Superheroes are the most common genre of comic book to produce, and understanding character design, proportions, poses, lighting, shading, color, and visual storytelling are usually crucial to being successful in this field. Graphic novels, manga, and other similar types of comics tend to be longer and may sometimes be more complex. Whereas comic books tend to expand on more perspectives and concepts in the same story or world, graphic novels tend to be more narrowly focused on their stories and character perspectives. Graphic novels, in many past and current instances, same which is true for me as well, can theoretically be done by a single individual or a small group of people working on the same project. Many of these kinds of projects are also more lenient, and do not need to fill quotas and can simply be created to the heart's content of the creator or creators. Graphic novels also don't have a set style formula to follow, thus leading to a variety of art styles across dozens of graphic novels. Understanding many artistic basics, such as light, perspective, posing, repeatability, etc., and understanding many writing basics when it comes to storytelling are important for creating a successful graphic novel. Webtoons did not start becoming popular until the late 2000s and early 2010s, but they are creating quite the buzz in the current online artist space. It is not uncommon for comic book artists and graphic novel artists to start out here in recent times, working on their own personal projects for online platforms like Webtoons and Tapas. Many of these webtoons are serialized and published in episodes, which feature a variety of panels, text, and images, and one long vertical strip intended to be read and scrolled through on smartphones for the most part. Many popular webcomics originate from Korea, but artists all over the world have gone to create digitally based stories and publish them online for all to view. Some webtoons have strict deadlines and can require a lot of work to publish more episodes on a weekly basis, but most webtoons are not subject to these hard limitations. As with graphic novels, and also somewhat with comic books, understanding many art and writing basics is crucial to creating a good story and art style for a webtoon, especially since many tend to be small or even individual projects as well. Many webtoons artists will post to the same platforms, which are full of eager comic readers of all kinds, so discoverability can be easier on that front even with heavier competition. And these are just the general differences between the different kinds of comics. I'd like to start up my own series where I talk about how I've learned the process of creating a comic, more specifically a graphic novel or webtoon style comic. And while I mostly have experience traditionally drawing a comic, as in on paper with pencil, even 10 plus years later, I think I have a lot of feedback and advice that can be used for aspiring digital comic artists as well. I've already got plans to further talk about topics like tool selection, scripting, panel layout, dialogue, character design, so on and so forth. But if anyone has any other ideas, I am open to suggestions. And of course, also keep in mind that I am primarily creating this video series as a hobbyist comic artist, not necessarily a professional. So I'm sure that there are so many other good videos and YouTubers and tutorials out there that can better help if you want to make a more professional career out of this. But for those who just want to get their feet off the ground, who just want to do this something on the side as a hobby, I don't know, maybe I could teach people a thing or two. At least that's what I'm hoping. Thank you for watching this far into the video. A big shout out to all of my patrons that continue to support me and my creative projects and endeavors. You guys help me not just with all my videos, but many of my art and writing projects as well. And I hope to see everybody in the next video where I talk a little bit more about the process of making comics.